The start of the movie takes place in a somber place, particularly at a house near a beach. We see a woman busy with house chores. Her cleaning duty goes on for quite a while, and all of this is happening in an unsettlingly quiet environment. After some time, we see a shot of a door, followed by a short glimpse of something entering a cabinet. The lights turn off, and we hear muffled cries, doors slamming, and glass breaking. Although we don't see it, it is implied that something tragic has happened to the lady cleaning the house. Seconds later, the tragedy is confirmed as the lady's lifeless body is seen washed up the shore, and an unknown person discovers her remains. That night, the house is shrouded in darkness, but only a single room is lit. The next day, we see a woman named Eve driving along a road, with her son, Noah, seated at the back. After what seems to be hours of driving, they finally arrive at a place by the seaside. When they finally reach their destination, we find out that it's none other than the creepy house seen earlier. The mother and son get out of the car and take their belongings inside, unaware of the sinister force lurking around. We also get the point of view of one neighbor, watching from the window as they enter the house. Noah immediately plops down on the couch and plays video games, while his mother gets some chores done. While removing clothes from her suitcase, Eve sees the military belongings of her late husband and stares at it for a few seconds before setting it aside. She then looks out her bedroom window to take in the serene view of the sea. But then, when she steps away for a second, we see a mysterious man standing outside, and beside him is a dog. Later that night, during dinner, Eve asks Noah if he wants to explore the beach tomorrow. However, she has to repeat herself since the boy is busy with his tablet. Noah gives an unenthusiastic answer, causing his mother to sigh. Sometime later, the weather goes awry, as winds howl and a storm seems to be forming. Eve is on the couch sipping wine and sketching. Noah brings back some firewood, earning praise from Eve. When she asks if he's okay, the boy admits that he's thirsty, so he goes to the kitchen to drink some milk. Strangely, a glass of milk and a cookie is already there for him. When he joins his mother back on the sofa, Noah notices that there is no Wi-Fi signal and that his tablet is low on battery. He goes to his room to check his backpack, looking for his charger. All of a sudden, he hears a dull thud coming from another room. Holding a tiny flashlight, he goes inside and sees that a window panel is unlocked, so he closes it. However, he quickly hears another thud coming from the unlocked closet. He closes that too, but as soon as he steps out of the room, he hears a slam. This noise catches Eve's attention downstairs, prompting her to call out to Noah, asking him if he's okay. Instead of answering, Noah goes back into the room for a second to check, but quickly gets out and rejoins his mother. When asked if he found his charger, he simply shrugs. Noah asks to see what Eve is sketching and comments on how the drawing doesn't look like him. However, their conversation is abruptly interrupted by loud noises coming from upstairs, resembling the sounds of heavy footsteps. The boy tries to play it off as nothing but the sound of the wind, but as the noise gets louder, the mother and son duo can't help but investigate. While outside her room, Noah reassures her shaken mother that there is nothing inside. Eve hugs her son before declaring that it's time for bed. Shortly after, we see her tucking him in bed. Noah expresses how he misses his father, and Eve can't help but admit that she misses him too. Before Eve heads back to her own room, Noah requests for her to shut the door. Next, we see a flashback of an intimate moment Eve had with her husband before he left for Afghanistan. As he steps out of the door, Eve awakes from her dream, hearing the sounds of crashing waves and cooing birds. She then notices a strange woman sitting on the bed, smoking and looking at the window. However, this woman quickly disappears, as if she was never there in the first place. Later that day, Eve and Noah head out to the beach. With a buck in one hand and a net in the other, the boy is ready to collect seashells. Meanwhile, his mother is contently observing him from a distance and drawing on her sketch pad. When they return to the house, they encounter a strange old woman named Myrtle, who is calling out to someone named Lydia. Perhaps she mistakes them for someone she knows. After clearing the misunderstanding, the old woman introduces herself as their neighbor. Noah gets acquainted with her and even shows Myrtle some of the seashells he picked on the beach. While awkwardly having tea with Eve, Myrtle notices the blank look on Eve's face while she's holding her husband's dog tag. She asks if it hasn't been long since her husband passed, while also giving unsolicited advice about how time can heal everything. Eve hides the dog tag in response, clearly not wanting to talk about it. She tries asking the old lady to stay for lunch, but Myrtle declines and leaves hastily. Later, mother and son brush their teeth together, and after that, Eve tucks Noah into bed as usual. For a brief moment, we see the silhouette of the mysterious man and his dog outside of the house, illuminated by the bright moon. Eve tries to get a peaceful night's rest, but her emotions get the best of her. She sobs while in bed, indicating that her grief is still weighing heavily on her mind. Her emotional moment is interrupted by the rattling of the nearby doorknob. After a suspenseful few seconds, the door swings open and Eve is relieved to see her son. Noah shows concern for her well-being. They decide to sleep in the same bed that night. But even with Noah by her side, Eve can't help but let out muffled sobs. The next day, Noah is excited to finally catch a crab. However, an unnamed boy throws a rock at him as a prank. Noah chases the boy and tackles him. When asked why he threw something at him, the boy changes the topic, asking Noah if he wants to see something good. Then, the boy leads him to an abandoned garage, where they see a plane that looks like it hasn't seen flight for quite some time. Later that day, Eve is busy sketching a building. Meanwhile, Noah returns home and finds a cake on the kitchen table. He immediately grabs a knife, just as his mother walks in and tries to cut it. Eve tells him that she's not the one who made it, so the boy assumes the old lady left it there for. Suddenly, their attention is grabbed by gunfire from a distance. Eve closes the doors and checks out the scene outside. A man named Joe is out there, wielding a shotgun, and calling out to anyone nearby. We also see a dog named Gracie with him. Joe stands outside Eve's home, and the woman hesitantly opens the door. He invites himself in after his dog rushes inside, and he introduces himself to Noah and Eve. Noah seems more excited to see the man, while his mother has her guard up, not knowing what the man wants. Based on Joe's initial questions, it seems like he's just a friendly neighbor, wanting to know if they need any help with anything. The boy asks Joe to join them for a cup of tea. In the kitchen, the man enjoys the mysterious cake. He then asks them if they want him to give them a tour of the place. He starts talking about a good place to visit, one that requires them to board a ferry to get there. Noah shows enthusiasm, asking his mom if they can have a picnic there. The conversation is interrupted by the oven suddenly swinging open, hitting the back of Noah's chair. Joe stands up to close it, stating that there must be a strong draft inside the house. The next day, the trio boards the ferry to head to the picnic location. When they arrive near a lighthouse, Noah and Joe play a simple game of seeing who can throw rocks farther. They continue walking until they reach the seaside, where they eat their picnic snacks. After a while, Joe gets up and entices Noah to race him to the lighthouse. Eve watches them with a smile, thinking about how the scene is reminiscent of a time when her husband was still with them. Meanwhile, Eve tries calling a military major a few times, but her calls get forwarded to voicemail. After Noah and Joe finish playing, they rejoin Eve. The boy pretends to shoot his mom with finger guns, expecting her to play along. However, she doesn't find this joke amusing, because such a scenario is close to how her husband perished. She grabs Noah's hand, and they start heading back to the ferry. On their way back, Joe tries to talk to Eve, attempting to apologize for inciting the boy to play an insensitive game, but she's having none of it and remains silent throughout the trip back. Eve gets in her car with Noah and drives away without saying anything back to Joe. Later that night, Joe knocks on Eve's door bearing a gift. However, when no one answers, he leaves the gift on the door and walks away. We see the mother and son inside the house, waiting for Joe to leave. Once he is out of sight, the boy asks if Joe is coming again tomorrow. Eve makes it clear that the man is no longer welcome in their home. This upsets Noah, causing him to raise his voice at his mother. After the brief argument, Eve sends her son upstairs, exercising her authority as a parent. Noah runs up to his room and cries, feeling like his mom is being unfair for some reason that he can't comprehend. He sees his miniature train track on the floor and starts playing with it, bringing him joy for a brief moment. Later that night, Eve opens the front door to check what Joe left. When she finds out that he gave her 2 fish, she immediately chucks them in the bin. After preparing a microwaved meal, she checks on Noah in his room to tell him that dinner is ready. The boy isn't enthusiastic about dinner, but he promises to join her to avoid her ire. When Eve closes the door, we see the unknown boy from before inside the room, smiling at Noah. During dinner, the boy barely finishes his meal. The uncomfortable tension between mother and son is still palpable. Later, while Eve is taking a bath, she hears strange knocking noises again. When she goes upstairs to wipe her window clean, a ghostly female figure slams into the window, causing Eve to move back in haste. The figure quickly disappears, but the sound of the sobbing ghost remains. Unable to process what she just witnessed, Eve cannot help but break down in tears. Below, Noah hears his mother's cries, but this time he chooses to cover his ears instead of going up to console her. The next morning, Noah is no longer mad at his mother. He even prepares breakfast for her and brings it up to her room. Since Eve is still fast asleep, he leaves the food on top of the bedside drawer. After that, he goes to the beach to relieve his boredom. Later that night, Eve is still in bed, wallowing in misery. Noah comes home to an empty kitchen table, which he finds odd because Eve would have prepared dinner by that time. He goes upstairs to check on his mom, calling for her outside her bedroom door. However, the woman ignores him, choosing to stare blankly at the open window. The boy decides to go back downstairs and prepare a microwaved meal himself. Later, both mother and son hear footsteps and the opening and closing of a door. Both of them think that it's the other who is making that noise, unaware that neither of them did, but a third entity. Back in Eve's room, she finally sits up to take some pills. While doing so, the ghostly figure of a woman materializes inside the room, looking at Eve menacingly. As Eve downs the pills and takes a sip of her wine, the ghostly woman fades away. When Noah turns the lights off downstairs, he gets startled by a loud bang from upstairs, but he pays it no mind, assuming it's just the wind. In bed, he opens a black box and takes out a medal belonging to his late father. He pins it near his chest and goes to sleep. Late into the evening, Eve is woken up by distant screams of Noah, calling out to her. When she heads to her son's room, only a flashlight remains in his bed. The boy is nowhere to be seen. She rushes out of the house and sees Noah standing still by the rocky side of the beach. She calls out to him, but the boy remains unresponsive. When she finally reaches him, Noah snaps out of a trance, asking his mother how he ended up outside the house. The boy apologizes, so Eve gives him a hug, reassuring him that she's not angry and that everything is okay now. After going back inside the house, we see Joe standing outside, creepily observing them. Inside, Eve continuously flicks the fuse box switch, hoping the lights will turn on. Noah turns around and sees the enigmatic boy named Trevor. He asks him to turn the lights back on. As Trevor giggles, the lights turn back on, and he disappears at the same time. Eve then takes Noah back to his room and tucks him in bed. After she leaves the room, Noah discovers a photo book under the bedsheet, one that contains photos of military planes. When the mother and son are finally asleep, we see Joe outside finally walking away from the house alongside Gracie. The next day, Trevor arrives in front of the house. When Noah steps out, he immediately starts running with his good friend. After playing for a while, the two boys rest, and this is when Trevor inquires about the whereabouts of Noah's father. The boy reveals his father met his demise in Afghanistan. Noah then asks about Trevor's father, and the mysterious boy gives a confusing answer, stating that his father is slaying Germans in France. Shortly after, Noah starts heading back home. Later that evening, Noah visits Myrtle. There, the old woman shows him some old photos, explaining the stories behind some of them. After their short conversation, Noah heads home since it is starting to get late. In the next scene, we see Eve staring at herself in the mirror. When the boy returns home, he takes out the trash for a moment. Eve greets him, asking about his day. As usual, they eat dinner before heading to bed. Later that night, Noah hears a woman singing about losing someone. The voice doesn't seem to belong to Eve. Scared, the boy hides under his blanket for the rest of the night. The next day, Noah meets Joe outside of the house. He shows him a bike he procured and offers to fix it for him. Noah tells the man not to bother because he doesn't even know how to ride a bike in the first place. Joe takes it as an opportunity to teach the boy how to ride one. While teaching the kid how to ride a bike, we see Eve watching from the bedroom window, smiling. At one point, she even waves at Noah. However, from Noah's point of view, he sees a ghostly lady beside his mom, prompting him to ask Joe who the figure is. Joe, puzzled by the kid's question, points out that he's looking at his mom. All of a sudden, Eve looks back and sees the bedroom door is now open. She rushes out of the room and sees a woman heading downstairs. This woman looks at Eve before rushing out of the house. Outside, Eve wonders where the woman went. Then, she sees the lady's figure bulging through a hanging sheet. When she pulls it down, the woman is gone. It then mysteriously reappears outside the fence, as if taunting Eve. When she tries to approach it, she gets startled by Myrtle's presence. The old woman is there to give her some potatoes. The old lady notices Eve's chafed knuckles, asking what happened and suggesting she put cream on it. Then, Noah approaches his mother telling her that he cut his leg due to going fast on the bike. The boy emphasizes that it was his fault, not wanting his mother to blame Joe. Eve goes inside the house to get some plasters for the boy's wound. When she returns, she hears everyone talking about Myrtle's potatoes and how to cook them. This is when Noah comments about how Eve is the worst at cooking, which earns him his mom's glare. Myrtle leaves and Joe does the same, but not before promising to return later with a pheasant. Joe and Noah give each other a military salute, something that surprises Eve, yet she doesn't say anything about it. Later, after showering, Eve picks out a dress from her wardrobe and wears it. When Noah sees her wearing the dress, he is slightly surprised, because Eve has never worn a dress before. Regardless, her son thinks she looks good in it. He also hands her a lipstick, commenting on how he heard that putting on makeup makes girls happy. After painting her lips, she asks her son what he thinks, and she gets a positive response from him. During dinner with Joe, the man briefly talks about some historical events involving Americans, putting emphasis on their misdeeds. Noah finishes eating and excuses himself from the table, leaving Joe and Eve to have some time together. Joe gives Eve a compliment, making her a bit flustered. One can say there is romantic tension in the air, if not for the fact that Joe's facial expression resembles that of someone with ill intent. Eve offers to prepare some coffee, but Joe prefers whiskey. Later, their conversation continues while they listen to some jazz music. Joe talks about how most people who have lived there tend to leave. No one stays for long. When Eve points out that Myrtle is still there, Joe points out that the old woman is only clinging to memories of the past. Unfortunately, the talk about memories elicits a strong emotional reaction in Eve. She can't help but cry. This is when she opens up about the time she wanted to see her late husband's deceased body, but she was not allowed even a glance. Joe calms her down by pointing out that she still has her son by her side. She thanks him for his kind words. Joe then extends his hand to Eve, inviting her to dance with him. Wiping the tears on her face, she obliges. They press their bodies close as they dance slowly. In Eve's mind, she imagines her late husband as her dance partner. For a brief moment, a serene scene plays out wherein Cliff, Eve's late husband, tucks Noah into bed, just like how he used to. However, such fond imagery is grimly interrupted when Cliff turns around, revealing his mangled head. To add to the horrific scene, Eve also hears gunfire and screaming, similar to what his husband must have heard in his last moments. When Eve heads back down and checks different parts of the house, Joe is nowhere to be found. However, he's actually outside, observing like a creep, just like in the early parts of this movie. The next morning, before heading out, Noah spots his mother's sketchbook and takes a look at it. Oddly enough, it's only filled with sketches of him and nothing else. Outside, he gets on his bike and heads somewhere. Meanwhile, Eve is in Noah's room. She spots an old briefcase and opens it, revealing different memorabilia inside. She fixates on one particular letter and begins reading it. Going back to Noah, he's at the beach, walking. He spots a strange item that looks like an unexploded ammunition of some sort. Thankfully, before he can touch it, Trevor shouts from a distance to stop him. Then, he invites Noah to join him somewhere. The two boys observe the waves and Trevor points out the sound of bells coming from underwater. He claims that the sound is coming from a sunken town, and hearing it is a sign that a storm is approaching. Shortly after, Trevor runs away, leaving Noah puzzled. Back to Eve. She's taking a look at an old photo of a couple. Suddenly, she hears a metallic clatter coming from downstairs. When she heads down to check, she sees the oven door open and the stove is leaking gas. After she shuts it off, she approaches the door, only to get startled by Myrtle. The old lady hands Eve a bag of potatoes and notices the photo on the table. Eve almost blows them up when she tries lighting a match, but the older lady stops her in time. The two women continue their conversation outside. It turns out that Myrtle knows the photo, as it depicts a woman named Lydia and an American. She tells Eve about the time Lydia would wait for this American during the war, talking about how he'd fly his plane over their home whenever he arrived. Eve mentions the letter she found, containing all the promises the American told Lydia. The old lady talks about how none of those promises came to fruition, yet Lydia always believed them. Then she talks about the man's tragic demise due to a plane crash. Myrtle looks behind her and starts to hallucinate. She describes a scene where Lydia is patiently waiting by the seaside, holding a lantern. The woman is expecting the man to walk back to shore from the depths of the sea, an impossible scenario. This is where we find out that Lydia is the same woman who is haunting the place where Eve and Noah live. While Myrtle talks about a tragedy that involved Lydia and her son, Noah walks into the house. The boy notices the strange smell that came from the gas leak earlier. At one point, Myrtle starts to spout things that make little sense. When Eve points out that Lydia's husband was assassinated, Myrtle disagrees. She points out that the American she mentioned was not Lydia's husband. When the ladies get back inside the house, Noah shows them a piece of metal he picked up, but Myrtle is not amused. She is having an anxiety attack, so Eve tries her best to calm her down. Myrtle continues her story with a heavy heart. This is when she reveals that after the American's passing, Lydia had her son and turned on the gas so she could poison as well. Her husband eventually came back from the war, only to find out about the tragedy that befell his family. The man later, and Myrtle believes it was due to a broken heart. Retelling this story makes the old lady emotional, so she heads back to her home, crying. Later that evening, Eve continues snooping through the old envelopes. She even attempts to open one, but decides against it. She discovers a box of cigarettes and takes out a stick that seems to be in good condition. Eve remembers Lydia's apparition from a few days back, who is smoking. She decides to light the stick, but as soon as she uses a lighter, Eve gets hypnotized by the flame. In a split second, the scene changes to Noah, asking Eve why she brought him downstairs. Not knowing what the boy is talking about, she guesses that she might have been sleepwalking. Noah insists this wasn't the case, recalling how Eve was crying when she did it. All of a sudden, a surge of memories flash in Eve's mind. All of the strange incidents that happened in the house were due to her actions. Furthermore, these actions were similar to what Lydia did in the past. Based on Myrtle's earlier story, Eve demands that Noah get in their car. She plans to leave right that instant. Despite showing initial resistance, Noah eventually follows his mother's order. Eve hurriedly packs her clothes upstairs, but the apparition intervenes, locking the closet. When Eve forces it open, a wave of ghostly water rushes out from the closet, rendering Eve unconscious. The bright light even alerts Myrtle and Noah. The boy rushes back into the house. Unfortunately, Eve's room is locked from the inside. Lydia already has the woman under her evil spell. Despite the boy's loud cry, Eve does not respond. Now possessed by Lydia, Eve steps out of the house. Once she's near the seashore, she releases an ear-piercing cry, calling for her son. Joe and Myrtle also hear this. Not knowing what's going on, Noah rushes to his mother in a panicked embrace. In a matter of seconds, Eve starts her son into the sea. Joe sees this and rushes to the scene, calling for Eve to stop. However, she continues walking, despite Noah's desperate pleas. When he finally gets to them, they are already in the deeper part of the water. Joe does his best to rescue the boy. Unfortunately, just as he's about to grab Noah's hand, the possessed Eve grabs the boy's ankle, ready to drag him down to the depths. Noah turns around and removes Eve's necklace. This causes the spirit of Lydia to exit the woman's body, snapping Eve out of the trance. However, when Eve finally realizes what's happening, her son is already sinking to the bottom. Joe is able to grab Eve and allow her to get to the shore. As soon as the woman's head emerges from the water, she shouts at Myrtle, urging her to call for help. The old woman runs back, but her old frail body betrays her. Myrtle falls down to the ground, shifting back to the depths. Noah manages to break free from the ghost. His body floats up, while Lydia's apparition sinks deeper. Eve lets out anguished cries at the shore, desperately looking for signs of her son. An overwhelming sense of relief fills her entire being when she finally sees her son emerge from the water in Joe's arms. The man carries Noah back to the shore and into Eve's arms, and with that, a great tragedy is averted. The next day, the mother and son are peacefully sleeping together. Meanwhile, Joe heads out. His dog discovers Myrtle's lifeless body on the ground. A picture of Lydia lies right beside her. In the next scene, Trevor waits for Noah to step out of his house. When he does, Trevor gives him a small toy car. After accepting the gift, Noah meets his mother outside, and they share a hug. Both of them are now ready to leave the place. Eve glances at the sea one more time, still processing everything that happened. Joe approaches her, asking her to consider visiting during the summer. He promises the weather will be lovelier by then. Smiling, Eve promises to do just that. Joe also approaches Noah, telling the boy to take care of his mother. During the car ride, Noah glances at a picture. This is the other half of the picture that Myrtle had in her hands. It shows Joe and Trevor. This is when it finally becomes clear that Joe and Trevor are both ghosts as well. It turns out that Lydia was jealous of Eve, thinking she was trying to take her family from her. The movie ends with mother and son driving away from the haunted place, fortunately still alive.